My name is Lieutenant Commander Emma Cole, United States Navy. And on the day my sister got married, I heard my own father tell a room full of people I was the CAL's janitor. 5 minutes later, someone shouted, "Oh my God, is that her on TV?" And my father dropped his champagne glass in the middle of the reception. The sound of crystal breaking can slice right through a room. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand the silence that came before it. It was the kind of wedding Charleston does best. White tents on the lawn of an old plantation house. Spanish moss swaying in the breeze. A jazz quartet warming up under the awning. My sister Olivia had dreamed of this since we were kids. And I was about to let my own complicated relationship with our father cast a shadow over her day. I'd flown in the night before from Coronado, California, still shaking off the rhythm of base life early PT runs, briefing rooms, the quiet hum of servers in the operations wing. For the wedding, I was wearing my navy dress whites. Olivia had asked for it. She said it would look badass in the pictures, and truth be told, I wanted to make her proud. The first hour of the reception was all polite handshakes and catching up with relatives I had unseen in years. My father retired. Colonel Richard Cole was holding court near the open bar. He was a man who could fill a room without trying, tall silver-haired chest like a barrel and a voice that carried like a drill instructor's. He had always been more comfortable around military brass than his own children. I was about to join a conversation with an old family friend when I heard his laugh, that sharp, almost theatrical bark he used when telling a story. "She's the SEAL's janitor," he said, grinning at the small circle of men around him. They laughed, some politely, some genuinely, and I felt the words land like a punch I couldn't block. He'd said variations of it before, always in that joking tone. But here, in this setting, with Olivia's day unfolding in perfect light, it stung differently. A couple of the guests glanced over at me. I smiled, the tight practice smile you learn in the service when someone underestimates you in a briefing room. Then I moved on, shaking hands, offering congratulations, pretending I hadn't heard a thing. But inside, I could feel the old familiar heat rise, the one that comes from years of being measured against an impossible yardstick. My father believed in real military service, which in his mind meant combat arms. My work in naval, special warfare support didn't count. Never mind the nights I'd spent awake tracking assets across hostile waters. Never mind the people alive today because of what my team had done to him. I was a janitor. I caught sight of Olivia across the tent, radiant in her lace gown, and forced myself to refocus. This was her day, not mine. I could endure another round of being the harmless kid sister, if it meant keeping the peace. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that before the night was over, the entire guest list would see me in a very different light. I wish I could say my father's jab at the wedding was an isolated moment. It wasn't. It was the echo of years, the same note played over and over. Until it became the soundtrack to how my family saw me. Growing up in a house run by a career officer meant our world was built on rules, inspection, and a constant undercurrent of competition. Dad believed the military was the proving ground of character, but only certain parts of it. Infantry special operations. Anything with a rifle or the word combat in the title, that was real. Everything else, support auxiliary. Necessary maybe, but not worthy of respect. When I enlisted at 19, I wanted his approval more than I wanted the paycheck. I pushed myself through boot camp, through specialized training, through the long, grinding weeks of working logistics for the Navy. My first assignment was in an intelligence unit, planning routes, moving supplies, coordinating with joint task forces. He visited once, walked through the operations center, nodded at the wall of screens, then asked me over dinner if I ever did anything outside an air-conditioned building. The thing about my father's comments was that they weren't always cruel in tone. Sometimes they were just casual, almost offhand, like he didn't even realize the weight behind them. That's what made them sting. The turning point, the one I never told him about, came 2 years later during Bud S, when I attempted the grueling selection process. Not to become a SEAL, but to qualify for the Navy Special Warfare Support Unit. It was a pipeline so few even knew existed. I pushed through the surf torture, the log carries the endless miles in soft sand, only to be pulled from training after a stress fracture in my leg. I thought that was the end, but a commander I respected pulled me aside and said, "You're not done. You're just taking a different door." That different door led me to the Elite Logistical Command that supports SEAL teams around the globe. The people who make sure those missions have the gear, intel, and extraction plans to succeed. We were ghosts behind the ghosts. But try explaining that to someone who measures worth in photo fights. Every time I came home for Christmas, Dad would hold court in the living room trading stories with other vets. While I sat in the corner sipping coffee invisible, once in front of my brother and a few of his army buddies, Dad grinned and said, "Emma, here. She's probably the reason the SEALs have clean barracks." They laughed. I laughed, too. Because what else was I supposed to do? You learn to carry those moments like sandbags. Heavy, awkward, but part of the load. Over time, you stop trying to set them down. You just get stronger at holding them. By the time the wedding rolled around, I had stopped expecting anything different. I wore my uniform because Olivia asked me to. I stood in formation for the photos because it made her happy, and when Dad tossed out his line about being a janitor, I just added it to the pile. What I didn't realize was that somewhere beyond that white tent and Spanish moss, the pile was about to collapse. And when it did, everyone in that room would feel the impact. There's a reason I didn't correct my father when he called me a janitor. It wasn't just restraint. It was the fact that I couldn't tell him or anyone what I'd actually done. 2 years before Olivia's wedding, I was assigned to a joint task force operating out of the Pacific. The kind of assignment where your phone calls are monitored. Your travel is compartmentalized, and you learn to forget what day it is. Because dates don't matter when you re on 20-hour rotations. Our mission window opened on a humid night in May. 2 Navy SEALs had gone missing in the South China Sea. During what was supposed to be a low-visibility reconnaissance patrol, intelligence suggested they'd been captured and were being held in a fishing village, sympathetic to an armed militia. Time was against us. The longer they stayed put, the less likely we'd get them back alive. My job wasn't to breach doors or clear rooms. My job was to make sure the people who did could get in, get out, and not leave a trace. That meant securing an unmarked vessel capable of hugging the coastline without being detected by radar. It meant arranging for aerial refueling of our recon drone without triggering Chinese surveillance networks. It meant finding a way to disguise our encrypted communications as harmless chatter between fishing boats. And it meant doing all of that in 48 hours with nothing more than a skeleton crew, an aging server room, and a stack of favors I'd built up over a decade. When the typhoon warnings hit half, the command wanted to abort, but weather cuts both ways. The same storm that threatened our route also provided cover. I greenlit the plan. We pushed a supply drop through the outer bands of the storm. Using a local cargo plane with a forged manifest. That drop included the medical kits, ammunition, and extraction harnesses that would be used hours later. I monitored the whole op from a darkened control room. The sound of rain, hammering the corrugated roof. My headset filled with bursts of coded chatter. When our extraction team called package secure, I allowed myself one deep breath. They made it out, slipping into the storm like they'd never been there. The report filed afterward was 3 pages long. My name appeared once buried in the list of logistics officers. 2 weeks later, I was back stateside sitting at my father's kitchen table. While he asked if I'd done anything interesting lately, I said, "No, that's the curse and the honor of the job. You measure your victories and lives saved, not headlines earned. The only people who truly understand are the ones who've been there with you." So when he joked about me mopping floors for the SEALs, I didn't bite. He wasn't wrong in the literal sense. I did clean up after them, just not in the way he thought. The string quartet was easing into a slow, brassy version of At Last when I slipped back into the reception tent. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Champagne flutes, clinking waiters weaving between tables with trays of scallops and bruschetta, the bride and groom laughing in a swirl of silken light. Inside my head, though, the conversation at the bar still echoed. The SEAL's janitor. I told myself to let it go, to be the bigger person. But when you've spent years mastering calm under pressure, you also know exactly how far your composure can stretch before it tears. Dad was still planted near the bar, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing as he spoke. The group had shifted. Now it was uncles, a few of his old army buddies, and a couple of family friends. I caught snippets as I passed real soldiers, front lines, paper pushers. They laughed at the right beat, some out of politeness, others because they thought they were in on the joke. I could feel eyes flick toward me as I made my way to the head table. That subtle assessing look people give when they've been primed to see you as something less. I paused near the cake table when I caught a fragment of conversation behind me. A man's voice low, but carrying. "Yeah, I heard she's Navy. But not you know that Navy." Laughter followed quick and short, like the pop of a cork. I wanted to turn around to set them straight. Instead, I moved on each step deliberate. Olivia intercepted me with a hug, blissfully unaware. Her world tonight was all flowers and vows and dancing. I hugged her back, careful not to let the weight in my chest seep into my smile. She adjusted the fall of my uniform jacket, complimented the shine on my shoes, and flitted off to greet another table. When the photographer called for the wedding party to gather, I stood in formation with the others, the white of my uniform cutting a sharp line among the tuxedos and chiffon. Dad stood off to the side, laughing with a champagne flute in hand. From where I was, I could see the way his posture radiated ease. As if his version of the story was the only one that mattered. In the Navy, I've been underestimated before. In training, even on deployment, most of the time, I've learned to use it. It's a kind of cover, let people think they VA got you figured out and they never see you coming. But tonight wasn't a mission. Tonight was personal. As I waited for my turn in the photos, one of Olivia's college friends leaned over. So she said lightly, "Do you actually work with SEALs? Or is that just a figure of speech?" Her tone wasn't cruel, but it was curious in that way. People are when they've already been fed a version of the truth. I smiled and answered, "I work where they work." It was the cleanest answer I could give without opening a classified file. She looked intrigued, but before she could press further, the photographer snapped the final group shot and dismissed us. I took my seat again as the toasts began. Glasses lifted, stories were told. The air grew warmer with each round of applause. All the while, the words kept circling in my head like a tide I couldn't push back. Janitor, paper pusher, not a real soldier. A waiter came by to refill water glasses. He set mine down a little harder than necessary, as though rushing to get to the next table. The ripple in the water caught the string lights above, breaking into scattered reflections, sharp and uneven, just like my thoughts. I thought about the two SEALs whose hands I'd shaken in the hangar after that stormy rescue. The way one of them had looked at me and said, "We wouldn't be here without you." It was a truth that no one, under this white tent, maybe not even my own father, would ever fully understand. My fork hovered over the plate as another round of laughter erupted near the bar. Dad's voice carried over the music again, deep and booming. I didn't catch the words this time, but I didn't need to. I already knew the script. What I didn't realize was that understanding was about to arrive loud enough to silence the whole damn room. The best moments at weddings are supposed to be the quiet ones. The slow dance between the couple when everyone else fades away, or the moment when a parent catches the eye of their child and you can see a lifetime in that glance. But what happened next wasn't quiet. It wasn't gentle. It was the kind of thing that turns 100 heads at once. I was halfway through a forkful of roasted chicken when I noticed a ripple of distraction moving across the room. At first, I thought it was the servers clearing plates, or maybe the DJ testing the sound system. But then I saw a teenager in a navy blue suit sitting at the back table near the dessert bar, staring at his phone like he'd just seen a ghost. "Oh my God," he said just loud enough to make the people at his table lean in. Then louder, "Oh my God, is that her on TV?" The words cut through the chatter, through the clinking glasses, through the faint strains of Frank Sinatra drifting from the speakers. Every head turned toward me. My fork stopped mid-air. Across the tent, I saw my father's posture shift. First confusion, then the faintest flicker of something sharper. He was holding a champagne glass. One finger looped through the stem. I knew that grip. I'd seen him hold onto a rifle the same way years ago. Steady, confident, unshakable. But right then, his hand faltered. The teenager's phone was already making its way from table to table, guests leaning in to see the tiny rectangle of glowing light. And there, I was not in my bridesmaid's seat, not smiling in a staged photo, but standing on the stage of the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes in full dress, white's a row of medals on my chest. The chyron across the bottom read, "Navy officer honored for distinguished service in classified joint operations." My voice played through tiny phone speakers. "This award is not mine alone. It belongs to the team who stood watch when others slept, who carried the weight when others could not, and who brought our people home." The video had been recorded earlier that morning before I boarded the flight to Charleston. I hadn't told anyone, not Olivia, not my mother, certainly not my father. Partly because I couldn't share all the details, and partly because, well, after years of being dismissed, some habits are hard to break. The room was so quiet now that I could hear the faint pop and fizz of the champagne in my father's glass. And then, crash, the stem slipped from his fingers. The glass hit the wooden floor, shattering into a dozen jagged pieces. Golden bubbles spread into a widening puddle. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. My father's gaze was locked on me, his jaw tight as if he were seeing a stranger. The man who had always believed I stood on the sidelines was now looking at a version of me he could unfit into the neat boxes he de-built over the years. The teenage boy, bless him, broke the silence. "It's all over the news," he said, almost breathless. "They're calling you a hero." I didn't know whether to smile or stand up or shrink into my chair. I chose stillness. Let them watch. Let the truth sink in without me saying a word. Somewhere in the background, I heard a fork clink against a glass, the signal for the next toast. But no one was paying attention to the speeches anymore. All eyes were on me and on the man who had just dropped his champagne glass. The wedding MC hesitated, microphone in hand, glancing between me and the frozen scene near the bar. You could feel the air change the way it does right before a summer storm breaks thick and expectant. Someone near the head table spoke first. "Lieutenant Commander Cole," they said, tentative, as if trying the title on their tongue. "Is that really you?" Every eye shifted to me. 100 faces, relatives, old neighbors, strangers in rented tuxedos, all staring, waiting. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the polished floor. "It's me," I said. My voice was steady, though my pulse was running hard enough to feel in my fingertips. I hadn't planned for this moment. I had thought I could slip through the night with nothing more than polite smiles and safe conversation. But here it was, the truth dragged into the open by a kid with a smartphone in a broadcast I hadn't expected anyone in Charleston to see. I walked toward the nearest table where a phone was still playing the Pentagon video. The image of myself on stage looked surreal. The bright lights, the rows of uniforms, the medal being pinned to my jacket. I had lived it just hours ago. And yet it felt like watching someone else entirely. A woman in a floral dress leaned forward. What did you do?" she asked. I glanced toward my father. He hadn't moved. His hands were empty now, but the shards of glass still glittered on the floor at his feet. "I did my job," I said. Then, after a beat, "And sometimes that job takes you places you can't talk about. Places where you have to make decisions fast, and pray you made the right ones." The room stayed quiet. You could almost hear people rearranging the picture they'd had of me from janitor to something they didn't have a neat label for. I gave them the simplest version I could. How 2 men had been stranded in hostile waters. How there had been no time, no margin for error. How we'd used weather to cover our approach. And how we'd gotten them out. I left out the coordinates, the names, the part where I'd gone 72 hours without sleep, or the fact that I'd been ready to risk a court-martial if the plan failed. When I finished, a few people nodded. A few others murmured words I couldn't make out, and somewhere in the back, an older man in a navy cap stood and gave me a crisp salute. I returned it without thinking. The MC finally stepped in, his voice lighter but careful. "Well, I think we've just learned we have someone very special in the room tonight. Let's raise a glass to Lieutenant Commander Emma Cole." Chair scraped, glasses lifted. The sound of the toast rolled through the tent, soft but sure. I caught my father's eyes over the rim of my glass. There was no smile, no apology, just the weight of something unspoken. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a map he'd spent his whole life drawing, staring at a coastline that shouldn't exist, and I knew then this wasn't the moment he would tell me he'd been wrong. That moment might never come. But I didn't need it the way I once thought I did. The truth was out. Everyone had seen it. And nothing he said or didn't say could take it back. The reception found its rhythm again, but it was different now. The laughter was softer. Conversations carried an undercurrent of stolen glances in my direction. Not the kind that came from gossip, the kind that came from quiet recalibration. The father of the groom, a retired Coast Guard officer, made his way over. "You know," he said, his tone almost conspiratorial. "I've worked with SEALs before. They don't give out medals like that to just anyone. You've done something worth remembering." I thanked him, but my eyes kept flicking toward Olivia. She was dancing with our mother, radiant as ever. For a moment, I wondered if she'd heard Dad's words earlier, or if she'd even care. This was her night, and I wanted it untouched by the kind of tension only years of family history could brew. I slipped outside to breathe. The night air was cooler than inside the tent, carrying the faint salt of the nearby harbor. Out on the lawn, the white light strung between the trees swayed gently. That's when I felt a tug at my sleeve. It was the teenage boy who'd started it all. "I didn't mean to embarrass you," he said, shuffling his feet. I just my uncle's a SEAL. I've heard the stories. And seeing you on TV like that, I didn't think people like you existed in the Navy. People like me. I crouched a little to meet his eyes. What you saw on TV, that's one moment. What matters most is what no one sees. The work you do when no one's watching, that's the part that keeps the mission alive. He nodded slowly, the way young people do when something clicks, even if they can't put it into words yet. When I turned back toward the tent, I caught sight of Dad through the open flap. He was laughing with one of his old army friends, the easy grin back on his face. If he felt any different about me now, he wasn't going to say. And maybe that was fine. Because here's the thing I'd learned. You don't always get the apology you want or the recognition you think you deserve. Sometimes the win is simply living in a way that makes the truth undeniable. I wasn't the SEAL's janitor, but if cleaning up meant making sure my people got home alive, I do it every damn time. I stepped back inside, letting the warmth and light fold around me. The music swelled. Olivia spun in her gown, and the shards of my father's champagne glass had been swept away. The mission wasn't to change him. It was to know without doubt who I was and to keep standing tall in the uniform I'd earned. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had someone define you by the smallest thing they think they know, remember this: your worth isn't in their words. It's in the work, the courage, and the truth you carry when no one else is looking. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe in honoring those who serve in silence, I'd be honored to have you stay for the next one.